Estou encantado de estar aqui. Eu gosto dessa sala. Eu tenho que ela tem uma vibração boa. Eu gosto da luminosidade dela, gosto do tamanho dela. Eu gosto de quem está nela. De modo que eu queria felicitar o arquiteto, felicitar o CEBRI e felicitar cada um dos presentes. E, sobretudo, eu queria dizer que nós estamos aqui com uma pessoa que fala com inteligência, serenidade, prudência sobre coisas complicadas. A primeira delas é o Brasil. Ele, numa manifestação de masoquismo, resolveu dedicar certo inglês, tantos assuntos que ele podia se especializar. Encontrou o Brasil um desafio à altura da inteligência dele. Quando que ele é um especialista em nós. Ele fala sobre nós com uma autoridade extraordinária e com uma generosidade lúcida. Nosso psiquiatra. Vamos felicitar a nós mesmos de tê-lo conosco em todas as suas dimensões. Ele vai falar sobre o BREXIT e com a sabedoria que ele tem, ele acrescenta duas palavras centrais: BREXIT, so far. Mas so far implica exatamente o que é um processo em andamento, como toda coisa caótica, por caminhos inesperados. Eu acompanho essa novela há muito tempo, como ele e eu somos contemporâneos. Eu me lembro que eu trabalhava na Inglaterra e Edward Heath era o primeiro-ministro. E era, talvez dos ingleses que eu conheci, o mais pró-europeu. Ele tinha uma devoção à causa. E depois trabalhando na França, onde havia uma oposição feroz de Gaulle à Inglaterra na Europa. De Gaulle foi nisso, com tanta coisa, um profeta. Ele achava que a Europa e a Inglaterra não era um casamento natural. Eu tenho um amigo que detesta a união de goiabada com queijo. Ele gosta de goiabada e gosta de queijo. Mas acha que, e diz que o nome Romeu e Julieta é apropriado. Não foram feitos por ninguém. Eu queria dizer ao Leslie que nós temos um dos assuntos mais palpitantes do mundo é o religioso. Eu não me antecipo porque eu não sei nem o que está havendo, nem o que vai acontecer, muito menos. Mas, essencialmente, eu creio que a desconstrução daquela ordem internacional, e que eu sou, de certa maneira, um empregado, um servidor e um crente, começou com o BREXIT. O BREXIT é o início de uma demolição. Eu não sei onde vai acabar, portanto é a matéria dele. Eu não quero dizer a vocês quem ele é, vocês sabem qual é o passado dele acadêmico, sabem qual é o passado dele em Oxford, o passado presente dele no Brasil, todas as coisas que fez. Talvez a melhor foi o mais avisado dos casamentos. Uma pessoa que é uma presença sempre lúcida, agradável, bonita, de modo que ele conseguiu do Brasil o melhor. Eu queria então dizer ao Leslie que depois eu falarei. Eu prefiro ter a última do que ter a primeira palavra. Porque ele falará, e depois de dizer tudo que sabiamente eu farei, uma espécie, como havia nos montes na minha mocidade, eu tomarei o estribo, serei um pingente e direi coisas que farão acreditar que eu pensei nisso muito, mas simplesmente eu estou tomando uma carona nas reflexões dele. Então eu agradeço a todos a presença, ao CEBRI Iniciativa, às Leslie por ter acreditado no Brasil e continuar acreditando no Brasil. E eu creio que nós vamos ter uma conferência tão interessante que eu creio que a terminá-la vai ser muito mais complicado, que foi minha tarefa de iniciá-la. Leslie, Florence.
Thank you, Pio, for the... First of all, I should apologize for treating this essentially English story in English instead of in Portuguese. I thank Pio for the invitation from CEBRI and thank Marcus very much for the generous introduction. Two initial points. I'm not a specialist on British or European politics. I'm a historian of Latin America, especially Brazil. But as a citizen of the UK, or some like to say a subject of the Queen, although I'm resident in Brazil, I'm frequently asked about Brexit, the decision of the UK, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, to exit the European Union, the EU, in June 2016 and all that has followed. Whenever I come to CEBRI, whenever I go to the Academia Brasileira de Letras, the first thing people say to me is, what's going on with Brexit? What's happening with Brexit? I even walk on the beach in São Paulo and people pass me and they say, Brexit, Brexit. And I'm not sure whether it's an abuse, but they do this. So I felt obliged to try and explain Brexit to myself as much as to you. And it's difficult to determine the right date on which to give this talk because things are moving the whole time. It's not, I imagined the title, Brexit, the end of the beginning. But it's not the end of the beginning now. It's the story so far. The second point is that I'm trying to be objective, of course, but it's evident from what I say that I believe that if it happens, and it still may not, it will prove to have been a disastrous mistake, a disastrously mistake taken. I'm a Remainer, or some people like to say Remona, that's the latest thing. I'm not happy with what has happened. And one day there'll be a public inquiry who was to blame for the fiasco it's generally agreed the Brexit process has been so far. The European Union, you remember, had its origins in the European Economic Commission, the Common Market, a customs union, formed by 6 countries, France, Germany, Italy, and Benelux countries, under the Treaty of Rome in 1957, in the interest, namely, of peace and security after 2 European wars, but also a project for economic growth already stimulated by the US Marshall Plan. The UK, Britain, was not a member. Churchill, after the war, made numerous speeches in favour of a United States of Europe, the importance of having a united Europe, but he was always very ambivalent about whether Britain should join. And this is the first point I really want to emphasise. The English, and Brexit is above all an English project. The English have always been ambivalent about Europe. An island, if you include Ireland, 2 islands. When I was a child, we always referred to Europe as the continent. Something over there, nothing to do with us. We're an island. Britain was never invaded, not since the Normans anyway, and intervened in Europe, they think, to save Europe from Napoleon, from the Kaiser, from Hitler. Britain had a worldwide empire, which turned into a Commonwealth, much more extensive than the French or the German or the Italian or the Dutch empires. And Britain had a special relationship with the United States. And so the English never really identified with Europe. A recent poll, just literally this year, showed after 25 years of being in the European Union, Britain came 28th out of 28 in terms of the level of identity with Europe, 35%. The average for Europe as a whole was 65 to 70%. The British were 28 out of 28 in feeling an identity as Europeans. There were 2 early half-hearted attempts to join in the 60s, which were vetoed by de Gaulle. Britain finally entered in January 1973, along with Ireland and Denmark. The 6 became 9, soon followed by Greece, Portugal, and Spain. The 9 became 12, and of course it's now 28 members. This was as Marcus said, this was the Conservative Heath government that took Britain, UK into Europe, but only because the party was even then split with the help of Labour votes. In 1975, a Labour government under Wilson introduced a referendum to ratify the entry, and the referendum was carried 2-1. But there still remained widespread suspicion, prejudice, ignorance, really, about Europe in the UK. Some on the left, Eurosceptics. When I was young, I was a Eurosceptic, the Labour Party. Worried about the cost, worried about the bureaucracy, worried about the democratic deficit, which still exists in the EU, worried that maybe the EU was a free market neoliberal conspiracy which would prevent socialism in the UK. Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party now, voted against Britain's entry into Europe in 1975 in the referendum, and he's still a Eurosceptic. But most of the opposition to Europe was in the Conservative, we have, as you know, two-party system with a third Liberal Dems. The Conservative Party housed most of the Eurosceptics, worried about national sovereignty, worried about independence. And this slowly intensified over the following decades. With the European monetary system, the worry that Europe was moving towards unity in the currency. Thatcher, for example, who began as a strong European, was overthrown because of her opposition to Europe. In her memoirs, she says, "I wish I had argued in favour of withdrawal from Europe." And she was overthrown by the pro-European group inside the Conservative Party. So there were splits in the 1980s, splits in the 1990s, the Maastricht Treaty in 2009, in 1992, which created the single market for goods, services, capital and people, strengthened the sense in the conservative right. The Lisbon Treaty of 2009 reinforced this, that Europe was moving to deeper economic and political integration, ever closer union, which threatened British national sovereignty. And in particular, Britain was losing control of the borders, because free movement of people, with now, after the period 2004 to 13, 28 members of Europe, and all those peoples of Europe could enter the UK freely. And the issue of immigration became central. And it was felt by the right of the Conservative Party that this was too high a price to pay for the economic advantages of being in Europe, and even maybe the geopolitical weight that it gave the UK being in Europe. Of course, they had the fantasy that out of Europe, the economy would do even better, and out of Europe, Britain would be more independent and more powerful. The 2010 election, and the Tories won under the wretched David Cameron. You can see how objective I'm being. After 13 years of Labour. Immediately, there were Tory rebellions. Almost every month, there was a Tory rebellion in favour of leaving Europe, and then beginning to demand a referendum to leave Europe. At the same time, the UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, led by Nigel Farage, another wretched figure in British politics, founded in 1993, extreme right, nationalist, xenophobic, anti-EU, anti-immigration. But for 20 years it didn't do anything. It secured less than 3% of the vote in national and European elections until 2014. In the European elections of 2014, UKIP came first with 27.5% of the vote. So Cameron is being badgered by the Tory right on Europe, and he's looking over his shoulder and seeing the rise of UKIP. In the 2015 election, Cameron made the fateful promise that there would be a referendum. A huge political gamble. He assumed he would win. In fact, as he commented to more than one person at the time, now much commented on, he admitted it was a question of party management, nothing to do with the national interest, party management, to end the Tory opposition to the EU and to see off the threat from UKIP once and for all. The Tories won the election, and Cameron fulfilled his promise to have a referendum on Europe. Of course, he made another serious mistake. He was so confident of winning that he was happy to have a 50-50 split in the referendum. Now, on something as fundamental as the unilateral withdrawal from the EU after 40 years of economic and political integration, he should have suggested a 60-40 or even 70-30 split, given that the turnout would only be 70% anyway. And the promise was that the referendum would be advisory, and he allowed it to become binding. The referendum, as you know, in June 2016 produced a victory for Leave, 52 to 48. And briefly, just to remind you why, the Leave campaign, with its slogan, Take Back Control, had two wings. The official campaign, led by the Tory MPs and members of the cabinet, including Theresa May, without Theresa May, she voted Remain. But the Tory right argued over sovereignty, independence, Britain as a global trader, Britain's past glories. It was an English nationalist project to middle-class people in the home counties, in the south of England, in Wales to some extent. The unofficial Leave campaign, led by Farage, was a populist campaign, focused, with lots of lies, focused on immigration, and it's very unfortunate in a way that the referendum took place in 2016, which was the worst year for immigration into Europe in the previous decades. And since then it's already declined. But the key year for 1 million or more immigrants into the EU was precisely 2015. So the immigration issue was predominant. But what you have to remember, I think, is that people didn't vote just on Europe. The referendum was not, although it was about Brexit, Leave or Remain, the reason why people voted Leave was not only to do with Europe. Like the situation in the United States with Trump, as in most of Europe at the time, there was a strong anxiety, anger about austerity, about stagnant incomes caused by globalization and the Great Recession from 2008, a lot of concern about the political establishment failing the losers, the left behinds, a lot of hostility to cosmopolitan, rich London. The Remain campaign was weak. They expected to win. They focused on Project Fear. This is going to be very bad for the economy. Very little concern about making a case for Europe. And they nevertheless won overwhelmingly in London, all major cities, amongst the young, and as we'll see later, in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Cameron resigned. The hopeless, hapless Theresa May became Prime Minister by default. She was the third or fourth choice of the party at the time. They couldn't make up their minds. They settled for Theresa May, who was totally unprepared to be Prime Minister, and has proved to be the most incompetent Prime Minister in recent history. She voted Remain. The majority of the cabinet was Remain. The majority of Conservative MPs were Remain. The majority in the House of Lords was Remain. But she took the line. Brexit means Brexit. There's only one Brexit. And we must respect the will of the people. The will of the people were the 52% who voted. 36% of the British electorate voted for Leave. And this became, from now on in, the will of the people. Popular sovereignty rather than the sovereignty of Parliament. This is a new constitutional principle in the UK. Of course, she did this mainly to keep the party together, to satisfy the right, to avoid an increasing possibility of a split in the Conservative Party. In her October conference speech, in the famous Lancaster House speech, she set out her policy not to crash out, not just to walk away from it. This was not necessary. An orderly withdrawal, and to negotiate with the EU, to leave on good terms, so that future relations were possible. But the famous red lines: no customs union, no single market, the hardest possible Brexit, so that Britain became fully independent in its trade policy and fully independent sovereign country. In particular, controlling its borders. The priority was to avoid free movement of people. And her line also was, one famous line, Brexit means Brexit. The second famous line was, no deal is better than a bad deal. If I can't get what I want from the EU proves difficult, we walk away. Anything is better than a bad deal in her terms. And without fully discussing the strategy within the cabinet, it seems now, within the EU, about the conditions, the options, how to disentangle 40 years of legislation, how to get out of 700 treaties and renegotiate a whole range, how to do this incredibly difficult task, and at the same time establish some decent future relations with the EU. It was going to be economically damaging, whatever the hardline Brexiteers said. Nobody doubted that Brexit would be economically damaging. So work out some trade-offs. Brexit is a process. Brexit is not an event. And without a clear exit strategy, what does Britain want? How is Britain going to get it? And believing it was easy. All the Brexiteers at the time used to say, no, this is the easiest trade negotiation ever. We can settle relations with Europe within a few weeks. We can deal with this whole thing quickly, we'll have frictionless trade, everything over. A new word entered the English language, cakeism. Having your cake and eat it was known as cakeism, and this became general. On 20th of March 2017, another fatal decision, of course. Prematurely, it seems now, she triggered Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, gave notice to leave, without any serious preparation or negotiations, just announced, we leave. Under the treaty, that meant leaving in 2 years. Britain would leave on the 29th of March 2019. Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, Polish President of the European Council, said there was a special place in hell for people who wanted Brexit but didn't make any plans and strategy to achieve it. And then another fateful decision. May decided to call a snap election in June. She had a majority, but a narrow majority, and she could neutralise the extreme right Brexiteers who wanted to crash out without any deal at all by building up her majority. And although she won the election, she lost her majority. She came out of the election worse than before, more dependent on the Tory right, and now can only govern with the support of 10 MPs from the Democratic Unionist Party of Northern Ireland, extreme right, pro-Brexit. So she was even in a worse position, and there was no question of reaching out to Labour to solve the problem, because Labour was now in the hands of Jeremy Corbyn and the left of the Labour Party. And the fear in the Conservatives, of course, was if this goes wrong and there's an election, we could get Corbyn. Anything to avoid Corbyn coming to power. Formal negotiations with the EU began in June, and the EU made 3 conditions only. The EU did not wish the UK to leave. The UK determined to leave and took the view that it would leave within 2 years. So negotiations had to take place over the withdrawal treaty. And the EU made 3 conditions. There would be a divorce settlement. There would be some financial obligations from the UK to leave, if it was to leave in an orderly manner with the support. There would be a price to pay, and it came out to something like £40 billion. Secondly, EU and UK citizens would have to have their rights secured on both sides of the channel. And thirdly, Ireland. There must not be a hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And May was completely unprepared for this. In the campaign, Ireland, and I've done some research on this, in the campaign, Ireland was never mentioned. It was never an issue. The English are so arrogant and ignorant about Ireland that suddenly, and this is one of the ironies, the British have done so much damage in Ireland, now Ireland was to be the major problem in Brexit. The Irish question, very quickly. What is the UK? England and Wales. Wales conquered by the Normans, like England in the 12th century, by the English, and incorporated by about the 16th century into the English, under the English monarchy. Scotland, an independent state, joined England and Wales in the Act of Union in 1707, making the United Kingdom of Great Britain, England, Wales, Scotland. Ireland invaded by the Normans and then conquered as a colony by the English in the 16th and 17th century, but with major rebellions, Irish nationalist rebellions in the late 18th century, eventually the decision was taken to incorporate Ireland into, in 1801, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The 19th century is a history of Irish rebellion and resistance, culminating the Easter Rebellion in 1916, the Nationalist Republican Rebellion, Civil War, and the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922, the 26 predominantly Catholic provinces of Ireland. 6 of the 9 provinces of Northern Ireland, predominantly Protestant, insisted on remaining in the Union, and the UK became the UK of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The Troubles, the famous Troubles, began in the late 60s. That is to say, the first attempt to establish civil rights for the Catholic minority in Northern Ireland. And this became a violent 2 decades of sectarian violence that we're familiar with, and the Irish Catholics, Northern Irish Catholics, supported, of course, by the Nationalists and Republicans in Ireland, in the south. The conflict was ended with the Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, a huge achievement. Ireland dropped its territorial claims to Northern Ireland. The UK recognised that the Northern Ireland would remain in the Union only as long as it wished to. Government was devolved, power sharing introduced, and the nationalist religious royalties became blurred, and there was peace and stability in Northern Ireland, between Northern Ireland and Ireland, between Ireland and the UK. This was a phenomenal achievement, facilitated because both the UK and Ireland were members of the EU. There was no border. The 50-kilometre border between Northern Ireland and Ireland barely existed, an invisible border. Now, I think I said this in a talk here at BREXIT, at CEBRI, with an Irish economist talking about the Irish economy. 2 years ago, BREXIT means there is a border between the UK and Ireland across Northern Ireland. If you have BREXIT, you have a border. If you don't want a border, you don't get BREXIT. That was clear, but not clear to British politicians. This was ignored in the UK. It became a major obstacle to the withdrawal agreement. And the EU backed Ireland, of course, a member of the EU. They weren't going to back the UK in this conflict. They backed Ireland and insisted there will be no hard border restored. We should destroy all that had been achieved by the Good Friday Agreement. And this became the famous backstop. The result from rounders, I think, in baseball, they used the term backstop. Northern Ireland would remain in the customs union until the UK and the EU made a trade agreement. This, of course, the DUP, the hardline unionists, absolutely couldn't accept, because it made Northern Ireland different from the rest of the UK. And the result was that May had to agree that the UK would remain in the customs union until the trade agreements were settled with the EU. And it was sold to the hard line in the Tory party as, this is temporary, it's an insurance policy, it will never be triggered. Don't worry about it, it'll never be triggered. The withdrawal deal was agreed in November 2018. There's a withdrawal agreement, 600 pages, legally binding, all the details involved in the UK withdrawing from the EU, including the backstop. And there was it started as 7-page, I think it's now 20-page political declaration, a rather bland declaration about how we will see future relations and work out a trade agreement, etc. But in May's mind, not a customs union and no single market. And Britain was to leave on the 29th of March, with a transition period to December 2020 to get the legislation through, but no single market, no customs union. This, of course, did not satisfy anybody. The Remainers were hostile, and after all, 48% voted Remain, almost half the electorate did vote Remain, and they weren't happy that the 52% Leavers were now regarded as the people, the will of the people, a democratic vote. They were against Brexit, of course, and they secured, which was doubtful for a while, they secured the right to, the UK had the right to revoke Article 50 unilaterally. So at any stage, the UK would say, oops, this was a mistake, let's forget it all, we stay in the EU. Mainly Labour Remainers, a few Conservatives, Lib Dems, Greens, Scottish National Party. The Brexiteers were unhappy that this was a soft Brexit, and they were particularly unhappy that it left UK in a customs union with the EU for some indeterminate period. The really hard-line Brexiteers, the Economic Research Group, who believed that this was Brexit in name only, this wasn't Brexit at all, particularly this backstop problem again, the backstop. It was agreed in international law there would be no unilateral exit from the backstop. If no solution was found to the border, and in my view, there is no solution. They talk about new technology, we'll find ways of controlling the border with amazing new technology. There is no solution. If you don't want a border, you don't get Brexit. And they realised this, that they would be stuck in a permanent customs union while this business of the border was resolved someday. And they preferred no deal, crashing out, to a bad deal, to quote May. They preferred no deal to the bad deal and preferred to leave. So here was May, knowing how things were developing, but with a legal obligation to introduce what was called a meaningful vote in the House of Commons to ratify the agreement she had agreed. It was to go to the House of Commons in December. There was a panic, the realization that it was not going to pass, it was delayed. Finally, since the clock was ticking towards 29th of March, the decision was made to bring it to the House of Commons in January. It was rejected by the biggest majority in the history of the British Parliament. 240 majority against the deal, including 118 of her own party, Tories, and of course the DUP, the Irish 10. The highest total humiliation for May. But she soldiered on and brought it to the House again in March. Rejected again, a slightly smaller majority against, but still 149 against, including 75 Conservatives and the DUP. With the default position 29th March, May asked the EU for an extension, and they gave her 2 weeks, to the 12th of April. She brought the bill meaningful vote a third time, threatening, of course, if you don't back this, you will get no deal, which the Brexiteers were happy with. You might not get any Brexit if you're not careful, or you'll get a softer Brexit. But even promising to leave, she said, I will leave after the vote, and I will not preside over the second round. Even with all this, it was rejected the third time, majority of 58, 34 Tories. LBJ used to say, the most important thing that a politician must learn is how to count. And poor May missed out time after time. There were a series of indicative votes in the House of Commons, trying to find a majority that would find support across the parties, just sounding opinion. 8 proposals were brought forward, none got a majority. There was no majority in the House of Commons for anything, for Remain, for the customs union, for a second referendum, for a crash out. The biggest vote against was one thing they were sure about. They didn't want to crash out no deal. But in terms of what kind of Brexit deal, no majority for anything. And after 2 years, finally, May decided and realised she couldn't make any progress without Labour, without some Labour support. So after 2 years of refusing, she turned to Jeremy Corbyn. Now, Labour. There are many Remainers frustrated, I think I'm one, many Remainers frustrated by the failure of Labour to lead a push for Remain, after all, or maybe for the softest of soft Brexits. The majority of Labour MPs will remain. The majority of members will remain. But Labour had promised in its manifesto in 2017 to respect the result of the referendum. And Corbyn and the left, which now controlled Labour, were Eurosceptic. He'd always been Eurosceptic. He wanted Brexit, a much softer Brexit than May was offering, in particular a commercial, customs union, common market Mark II. But he wanted to leave. And also, he was making electoral calculations. Labour had the MPs with the biggest Remain constituencies and MPs with the biggest Leave constituencies. So the calculation, the electoral calculation of what would happen if Labour finally opted for Remain. And Corbyn wasn't prepared to do this, and he didn't have the votes anyway. He could count. He did count and realised that he didn't have the votes for a Remain. So they went into talks for the first time. May made no compromises. Labour insisted on a permanent customs union, and increasingly Labour was beginning to think there would have to be a confirmatory vote, a popular vote, to confirm whatever was hatched up out of these conversations. May therefore had to go back to the EU for a second extension. The EU was reluctant. Macron was willing to cut Britain loose, I think. Let's get this out of the way, let's just abandon the whole thing. But they did finally settle on another date, October the 31st, with firm conditions. You must use it intelligently, you must get a cross-party deal, or you must have an election, or you must have a second referendum. Tusk, the famous Tusk, wanted time for Britain to decide to cancel Brexit. Otherwise, October the 31st, crash out, no deal, no arrangement. That's the story so far. It's not even the end of the beginning. Because if you remember, when the withdrawal deal is finally agreed, that's just the first round. Then there has to be the transition period in which the status quo continues, but Britain and the EU negotiate their trade relations and economic relations in the future. That was to be nearly 2 years. Clearly by this time that wasn't enough. Probably there was talk already of extending the transition period for another 2 years, and every single specialist on Brexit, serious, people who understand the EU, understand the treaty, understand the arrangements, know that this will take years. This will take us deep into the 2020s. It'll be at least a decade to settle all the things that would have to be settled for Britain to be firmly outside the EU with a relationship with the EU. So what now? The short-term outlook. May says she's going to bring the bill back to the House in early June. That's in 2 weeks' time. Assuming that enough people are now frightened, enough Brexiteers are worried that they won't get, that they may get no Brexit at all, and enough of the softer Brexiteers are worried there will be a hard Brexit after all. All that's on the table is May's original deal. But from what one reads, there is little or no chance of this being accepted. It's already been proposed by Labour, Scott Nat's, Liberal Dems, Greens, and hardline Tories that are digging their heels in. And the DUP is certainly not going to vote for this. So this is going nowhere unless May and Corbyn come up with some miraculous compromise, but there's no sign of this at all. But she's going to try again. The Financial Times describes this as losing her way to victory. She thinks there's still a chance there. So we don't write that off completely, but it looks as though really no chance. The House of Commons. There are commentators who say, no, this is up to the House of Commons. Forget Corbyn and May in these inter-party negotiations. The members, this is a parliamentary democracy. There is now a level of popular sovereignty through the referendum. But now the House of Commons, Parliament, has to decide what to do. Could there not be another round of indicative votes? Could we not engineer a majority for something? So that it could be. The problem then is that it's been tried twice. There seems to be no form of Brexit which has a majority in the House of Commons. And positions have hardened. Positions are now harder than they were. And party loyalties come into play as well. And even if they came up with something, it could only be a Brexit with a customs union, maybe not a single market, maybe the customs union, the Corbyn proposal. It almost got through 2 months ago. Maybe this could be introduced and passed. It looks as though it won't. And even if it did, you need then a stable, permanent majority with the party leaders on board to implement the legislation. It's no good getting this through with 3 votes, because you then have a long period of negotiating, getting the legislation. There'll be a prolonged guerrilla warfare from both sides against this precarious deal, even if there were a precarious deal. So we have House of Commons stalemate, a British political class paralysed, public opinion still divided. There's evidence, of course it varies from different polls, there's now evidence that public opinion has shifted somewhat towards Remain. But don't get overexcited. It's not a dramatic shift, it's a modest shift towards Remain. In the meantime, 2 other factors have come to play. The European elections are being held next week. And Brexit is the dominant issue, of course. The Tories have collapsed. 10% in the polls. 10%. Britain's major political party on the centre-right. 10% in the polls. Labour not doing too well either, because of its indecision and inability to make a firm position on where it stood. This what was called constructive ambiguity. Well, it's catching up with Labour. We've run out of constructive ambiguity, and Labour has been punished. Labour supporters, I'm thinking of doing this myself, Labour supporters are going to vote Lib Dem, because the Lib Dems are firmly for, the Liberal Democrats are for Remain. And Remainers can't be sure anymore that voting for Labour is a vote for Remain. The Greens are doing well at 11%, the Lib Dems at 15%, but who's the beneficiary of this mess? The new Brexit party of Nigel Farage. Right populist. The people have been betrayed by both the Conservatives and Labour. They are the enemy of the people. They denied you Brexit that you voted for in 2016. This is anti-democratic. We need an independent sovereign nation. Make Britain great again. This is the line. Think where that's come from. Yes, this is used in many places now by the same sorts of people. It is very similar to Trump and similar to many other nationalist right-wing parties in Europe. And a colleague of mine wrote in The Guardian just a few weeks ago that he went to a Nigel Farage meeting where people were shouting, Nigel, 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 34% of the polls. He said it was the most frightening political event he'd been to in his lifetime. So there's a real possibility, unless the various parties for Remain can get together, and unless Labour can get off the fence and say that they are against Farage, against the Brexit he's offering, and in favour of Remain, the European elections would be a huge boost for the hard Brexiteers. No deal Brexit, crash out in October. And the second factor is the Conservative leadership. As I speak, the senior Tories are meeting May to try and persuade her to give a date for her resignation. There is day by day pressure for Theresa May to call it off and to leave. And of course that opens up the possibility of challenges, leadership challenge, and the fear amongst some people, of course the hope amongst others, that a hardline Brexiteer, and of course they're mostly frightened of Boris Johnson, would actually win the Tory leadership, in which case all deals would be off and we'd be facing a hard Brexit from the Conservative government, whatever anybody else thinks. Which is why when the Labour Party leaders go into negotiations with May, they have at the back of minds, we need a deal that is Boris-proof. We must be sure that whatever deal we agree will not be torn up by the successive to the leadership afterwards. The only alternative is a second referendum. People don't like saying second referendum. They don't confirmatory votes or people's vote, because there's no popular support. There's no known popular support for a second referendum. People are so fed up with the whole process. Every politician gets on the doorstep, get it done, find a solution, do it. The idea of going through a second referendum. And then if there's a second referendum, what's the question? What would the question be? Remain, maybe? Some don't want Remain on the ballot. Support for the deal? What deal? There isn't a deal that's been agreed. Hard Brexit? Well, we know there are lots of people in favour of that. And remember, until now, every commentator and every politician has assumed that a second referendum would produce a Remain victory. That is not certain, in my view. Finally, medium and long term. Well, there could be Remain if a parliamentary majority were to revoke Article 50. Not much chance of that. If a second referendum voted for Remain, yes, Britain would remain in the EU. Politics as usual. Economic dangers removed. Irish question solved. The Union intact. But a lot of damage has already been done. A lot of damage has been done in the last 3 years to the economy, to political parties, to the House of Commons, to the parliamentary system, to Britain's international reputation and its relations with the EU, and has put a strain on the United Kingdom. And there is now a clear, strong, right-wing populist, xenophobic, nationalist, right-wing populist party, led by Farage, looking good in the polls. The second possibility is maybe there could even now be a compromise deal. There might have to be another extension, but the EU doesn't look as very keen to offer another extension. It might take more time. Will there be more time? And if there were a second, and it would a new compromise deal, maybe built around the customs union, maybe the single market too. But if it were just the customs union deals with goods. Britain exports 47% of its goods to Europe. This is a major market, that's why it's important. But it exports 80% of services, finance, banking, insurance, tertiary education, law. This is much more important. Europe is the equivalent of the next 8 of Britain's markets, including the United States, in services. And all the focus has been on goods, trade, tariffs, the customs union. Unless there's a single market, and that means free movement to people, that isn't going to go very well. And then, even so, there would still be this long process of negotiations over years for the details and for the legislation. Third option, leave without a deal on the 31st of October, or before or later, whenever that's the final decision. No orderly withdrawal. This will be a political victory for those who make national sovereignty, taking back control, resisting the recommendations of the European Court, controlling the border against immigration, becoming independent, becoming democratic, because we've accepted the will of the people in a free referendum. That's a gain. And no cash payments to Europe. But of course, there will be short-term chaos. Everybody agrees with that. Or maybe even medium, long-term chaos. Airlines, medicines, a whole range of things. And this would be the most highly damaging to the economy. The loss of the market, the loss of the services market, pressure on public finance, pressure on the pound. And of course the Irish question. We'd have the border. We'd have the border. It is said that something like 10,000 civil servants in London are sitting there preparing for a no-deal Brexit. And finally, we haven't talked about this, and it's for another occasion, I think. Would Brexit lead to the breakup of the UK? This will be another irony. The Conservative Party, particularly the right wing in the Conservative Party, is committed to the Conservative and Unionist Party. That is the title of the party, the Conservative and Unionist Party. And they're committed to national sovereignty and the Union. Well, Brexit, which is why I began with this, Brexit is an English project. The Northern Ireland border will create the real possibility of more violence in Ireland. And given the demographic changes taking place in Northern Ireland year by year, and given that Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU, will we not see over the next 5, certainly 10 years, a move in which Northern Ireland joins Ireland in the EU, and we have, praise the Lord, united Ireland after all the long and complicated history of the relay of Ireland. Scotland, Scottish nationalism. Scotland has devolved government. It had an independence referendum in 2014. The referendum was lost, 55-45. But the Scots were reconciled to this because of all the advantages of being in the UK and therefore in the EU. The Scots also voted 62-38 to remain. The Scottish Nationalist Party won a majority in the 2015 elections. They're already now asking for a second independence referendum. Would you bet against the Scots voting against independence the second time if Brexit goes through? And then Wales, we don't need to spend much time on Wales. Nobody ever talks about Wales. Wales has devolved government, but there's no strong independence. Plaid Cymru is not a powerful force like the Scottish National Party, but they do believe in a more federal, more multinational state, and the possibilities will increase with Brexit. And so, last word, what is the impact of Brexit, if it happens, on the EU? The EU didn't want this, but the EU will lose one of its key members. This will be economically damaging to the EU, less than for the UK, but damaging, depending on what kind of deal or no deal is carried through finally. It'll be politically weaker. No UK threatens the idea of the irreversible path to greater union in Europe. 40 years of peace, 40 years of relative prosperity, and now one of the key elements is walking away. And this will encourage others. And there are strong right, nationalist, anti-EU parties already strong in most European countries contesting the elections next week. There are many observers who think the disintegration of the EU is more likely than the further integration of the EU. A YouGov poll last week showed that between 40 and 60% of people polled in all European countries believe that in the next generation the project will end. There will be some breakup of the EU. Of course, there's an alternative view that others thinking of leaving will think twice when they see what a mess it's been inside the UK. That they're less likely to leave, having seen how difficult it is to leave. And of course, there are those who think it's a good thing. Macron certainly thinks this. The EU will be better off without the UK. We don't have these nasty Farage people in the European Parliament. We don't have May or her successor causing trouble in the Council of Europe. Britain was never fully committed anyway. Good riddance. But that's the future of Europe, with or without the UK, and I guess that's a topic for another seminar.
Leslie, well done. I'll say a few words in English and then revert to Portuguese. But I must compliment you. You gave us an extraordinarily lucid presentation. You made sense out of chaos, which is one of the most difficult things I know. Of a very messy process, you made it sound as if it were ultimately something that unfolded by rational steps or by predictable steps. You gave us a sense that not everything is lost. And I thank you on behalf of, I think I speak for everyone here, for a very enlightening, a very lucid, a very clear-sighted view of one of the most complex problems I've faced in my lifetime. I have never seen deconstruction at this level and with this degree of complexity. So congratulations. I will revert now to my original Portuguese, and the quality of my thinking, I think, will sync with that. Thank you. Obrigado. Eu queria dizer umas poucas coisas, eu usei um pouco do tempo que eu tinha inicialmente, mas eu queria agora dizer umas coisas que a conversa, a palestra do Leslie foi tão estimulante que eu me sinto provocado a dizer umas poucas coisas. A primeira é que eu detesto Bruxelas. Vamos começar disso. Eu creio que ninguém que teve negociações com Bruxelas deixa de ter uma sessão pesadelista. Bruxelas não é uma burocracia nacional, são 28 burocracias nacionais justapostas. Em Bruxelas existe um pesadelo. Eles não convergiram para uma ideia unificada, eles se multiplicaram. É uma metástase de burocracias, regulamentações. Portanto, eu simpatizo enormemente com a rejeição.
A comissão.
A comissão. Cada vez que eu fui lá negociar alguma coisa, eu encontrava um pântano. Sempre vai haver, uma semana depois, 2 semanas depois, uma eleição e um dos membros. Nós não podemos, no momento, tratar disso, porque a Hungria vai ter um referendo delicado, uma eleição na Croácia. Isso não, sempre alguma coisa impede que você faça alguma coisa. É uma situação de você está sempre refém de problemas de múltiplos atores que não têm entre si, de fato, uma coordenação real, uma verdadeira identidade. Quer dizer, a União Europeia ou avança em direção a um Estado confederado, federal, ou aquela situação uma que eu simpatizo. Ao dizer isso, eu tenho horror a Nigel Farage. Então você veja, meus olhos estão sendo explicitados um a um. O Nigel Farage é o autor do mais insultuoso discurso que eu assisti na minha vida, de muitas décadas de diplomacia. Ele, numa reunião do Conselho Europeu, da Comissão Europeia, faz referências aos comissários, à Europa, tão insultuosas, tão condescendentes. A ideia é assim, o senhor parece um bookkeeper. Quem é o senhor? Quem o elegeu? Ele deslegitima de uma maneira, há nele uma arrogância pré-trampiana que vem me virar. Portanto, eu entendo as forças que estão em jogo. Eu lamento, eu creio que a vitória que houve no referendo sobre a Escócia gerou a esperança de que também no referendo europeu o mesmo resultado aparecesse, que seria uma consolidação. Você diz com muita razão, como os conservadores, como David Cameron, que entraram na história inglesa num papel que eu não invejo. Ele desafiou os fados e os deuses e foi procurando mais. Também a Theresa May, quando já tinha uma maioria direitinho, vai procurar ampliar a maioria e diminuir. Eu vi isso em outras ocasiões, esse hubris, essa acreditar que você pode. Eu tenho nessas horas pensado muito em Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle tinha uma ideia que hoje se revela muito verdadeira sobre as complexidades da Inglaterra na Europa. Ele via que a Inglaterra era várias coisas. A Inglaterra tem allegiances, tem lealdades divididas. Há uma Inglaterra, há um Reino Unido agora. europeu. Evidentemente, por geografia, por história, por proximidade, não há dúvida que a Europa é um destino inglês. Mas há um destino imperial, agora da Commonwealth, que é outra vocação e outra vertente poderosa. E há uma relação especial com os Estados Unidos, que é uma terceira. O rancor nas grandes capitais europeias hoje, a imigração em massa. Eu tenho não é uma teoria, que a teoria sugeriria uma reflexão que eu não tenho sobre isso. A imigração, enquanto em doses administráveis, ela é absorvida de maneira imperceptível e vai sendo incluída no tecido nacional. Quando ela ganha um patamar acima, ela é uma agressão e uma ameaça. E a atitude passa a ter uma irracionalidade primitiva. Quer dizer, quem são esses invasores que estão aqui? Sejam eles mexicanos ao sul, sejam eles marroquinos nas costas, sejam eles europeus do leste, o que seja. Nós estamos diante de uma situação em que houve uma erupção de imigração extraordinária. Eu, há muito tempo, me dou conta de que os milagres não acontecem nos santuários. O número de milagres que há em Fátima, ou em Lourdes, são 2, 3 por ano, 4, 5. No aeroporto de Roissy, ou no aeroporto de Heathrow, há 100 mil milagres por ano. A pessoa chega de uma situação de completa miséria, risco, e passa a ter uma expectativa de vida ao atravessar uma porta muito maior. Uma possibilidade de felicidade. O ser humano hoje tem informações absolutamente contínuas sobre o mercado de trabalho mundial. As pessoas estão com uma capacidade de decidir. Você na Inglaterra, ele reagiu ao Reino Unido a essa ameaça, sobretudo burocrático-migratória. São as duas coisas. Se chama de soberania, a recuperação. A soberania é o horror a Bruxelas. Eu não encontrei um inglês que não tivesse com relação àquele regulamentarismo belga. Quando eu digo belga, eu sei que é um conselho, mas não é uma acusação. Eu que sou tão amigo de Moule e Fritz, não faria uma crítica easy. Mas, de qualquer maneira, é aquilo. Portanto, eu queria dizer que nós estamos num... As palavras em inglês são muito boas. Quandary, predicament, mess. Nas minhas mesas eu não tenho uma grande contribuição. Com o mess, com o brasileiro, eu creio que eu tenho uma certa autoridade. Nós temos uma capacidade de desenhá-las, de conviver com elas, e Deus sabe, às vezes, escapar delas. Portanto, eu queria dizer a você, Leslie, que houve um momento latino-americano na Europa. Declarações, gestos altisonantes, posições de princípio, enunciações. Quer dizer, houve toda uma espécie de discurso sem julgar. Você chamou atenção, não se julgou. Quer dizer, as coisas eram feitas sem medir o preço, a consequência. Eu não quero trazer a coisa do Estado que seria ofensiva ao nível do Mercosul. Mas um pouco isso. São gestos em que a declaração parece sonoramente tão agradável que ela se basta em si mesma. Mas nós estamos diante de um desafio. O que eu creio é que no momento em que essa ordem internacional, de que eu sou sócio, admirador, e fui operário muito modesto, está tão ameaçado, eu creio que enfraquecer a Europa agora é enfraquecer o mundo que nós representamos. É dar à China, que já tem tantas vantagens construídas, mais uma. Quer dizer, a China não pode ter imaginado, mesmo as suas fantasias mais brilhantes, um momento em que os Estados Unidos fossem entregar o Trump e a Europa se desfizesse. Quer dizer, é uma situação mágica você ter os seus dois, não adversários, mas dois rivais, dois sistemas equivalentes se desconstruírem na sua frente, por uma razão de... Em suma, eu estou preocupado com o que isso é para você disse muito bem. BREXIT não é um fato, é um processo. Isso é um início de um processo de... Eu não sei. Eu não, como você é um bom historiador, eu sou um mau historiador. Mas eu, para trás, vejo com certa clareza. Para frente, eu não vejo um palmo na minha frente. Eu não tenho nenhuma previsão. De modo que eu queria dizer a você que a sua expressão trouxe todas as dúvidas à tona. Foi de uma clareza, com uma enunciação do que aconteceu, denunciado como extraordinário. E eu creio que agora nós devemos deixar, finalmente, com minhas desculpas, os que assistiram com tanto... Houve uma coisa extraordinária, Leslie. Quase toda a palestra que eu assisto, um pouco se esvazia durante a palestra. A sua houve um acréscimo. Eu achei que se você não fosse mais 10 minutos, nós teríamos eu queria felicitar você por ter retido a atenção, atraído um público adicional e ter deixado um pouco... Você fez... Há uma velha frase naquele filme sobre Churchill, em que eu creio que foi Lord Halifax que disse que Churchill, quando ele faz aquele discurso extraordinário, ele mobilizou a língua inglesa e mandou ela para a guerra. Você, na sua palestra, mobilizou a língua inglesa e deu a ideia a todas de como ela é um instrumento indispensável de clareza.
Before we have questions, let me just say, you began with a wonderful defense of the leave position with your hatred of Brussels. But typically of you, you end up with a brilliant defense of the EU. That's what I've learned to expect from you. Just three things came to mind, very small things, but they're interesting, I think. One is Farage, the despicable Farage, who could be about to play an important role. You can't even imagine that he could be playing such an important role. He has been a member of the European Parliament for 20 years. He's been collecting $20,000 a month in salary and extras for 20 years, while not going there, because he disapproves of it, and when he does go, rarely, attacking EU. He's now standing with a new party. He was UKIP, and UKIP failed, so he's seen the political vacuum. He's not stupid. He's seen the political vacuum, he's entered that now with the new Brexit party, and he is standing as a European MP for an institution that he wishes didn't exist and that he himself it would not stand in. It's quite extraordinary. And the other thing is immigration. I didn't talk much about the lies, of course, that were told by the Leave side during the campaign. But the most famous one was on immigration, because immigration was the key issue, of course, for many lower middle class, working class, white people in the north of England, the Midlands, the identity issue, the fear of immigration. And of course the Leave campaign had this extraordinary poster showing a long, long line of immigrants, and it said, you do realise that Turkey is about to join the European Union, which it was not. 70 million Turks can come here as soon as Turkey joins. And there's this long line of clearly Islamic, Middle Eastern immigrants waiting to come to the UK. And then just one final thing. Cameron clearly is now about to go down in history as the worst Prime Minister in British history for the decision he made. But of course, in terms of incompetence and the failure to carry through with the decision, poor Theresa May is challenging Cameron. And if I'm being really, let me be cynical for a moment. Why is she so keen to bring forward a fourth time a vote which we could be surprised, of course. There are surprises every day in this, but the assumption is that it will be defeated for a fourth time in the first week of June, when Trump is in London on a state visit, and the heads of state from all over Europe are gathering to commemorate D-Day on the 6th of June. In that week, she wants to bring this bill that will be defeated a fourth time. Let's be cynical. On May the 31st, 2 days before, she is no longer the shortest lasting Prime Minister in British history. Gordon Brown is currently the person who has held the premiership for the shortest time. If she can hang in to the 31st, she becomes the second. I can't believe that's true, can you? Sorry.
All right, thank you. Você quer... Não, está sendo gravado ou não?
Sim, sim. Não,
Helena.
trazer um pouco do Brasil, né? essa ideia de democracia parlamentar, do parlamentarismo, quer dizer, a base da discussão do PSDB lá atrás do Brasil, está voltando, dado esse nosso presidencialismo, sei lá, falido. E recentemente teve a mesma coisa, e tem sido muito falado a vontade da maioria aqui no Brasil também. Então, decreto de armas, que é legal, o porte, mas é vontade da maioria. Então, essa tendência plebiscitária, que eu acho muito perigosa, estou vendo, começa assim num mundo com muito mais tradição parlamentar do que a nossa. Então, a minha pergunta é a seguinte: o que a gente pode esperar para melhorar o sistema político se um país do parlamentarismo acaba cedendo, você acabou de falar, os membros da House of Commons estão sendo muito mais plebiscitários do que impondo a vontade. E de novo, a ideia que a gente tem sobre o parlamentarismo é que o governo que não funciona cai, né? Os votos de confiança estão aí para isso. E Theresa May é um exemplo de que nem sempre, né? Porque ela não cai, né? Ela não cai, apesar de tudo isso que você... Então, eu queria falar um pouco que você conhece, como é que está essa questão do parlamentarismo de fato, assim, né? A gente pode olhar o parlamentarismo com uma esperança para o Brasil ainda ou está tudo mudando?
Well, it's true that in normal circumstances, and things are not normal, but in normal circumstances, May would have resigned when she lost that first humiliating vote. She did not have command of the House of Commons. Therefore, she should resign in normal circumstances. But of course, it wasn't normal. It was a vote on a particular issue that arose out of a popular referendum. So she was always in a position to say, well, yes, my proposals have been voted down by the House of Commons, but I am fulfilling the wish of the British people in a referendum. And we promised in the manifesto in the election that we would honour the election. The Labour Party also promised to honour the result of the referendum. So I am following the wishes. And of course, you're right, this raises the whole issue in a representative parliamentary democracy where representatives are sent to the chamber, to the legislature, to represent the people and have sovereignty, particularly in the case of the UK, which doesn't have a constitution, of course. The Parliament is sovereign, or strictly speaking, the Queen in Parliament is sovereign. What the Queen approves in Parliament is law and cannot be overridden by any other law. For many of the Brexiteers, one of the problems with the EU is precisely that, of course, EU law in some circumstances overrides the wishes of Parliament. And the European Court and the judiciary generally, following directives of the European Court, have more power than the Parliament. So that was the question of sovereignty. But in the question of the plebiscite, there have only been 3 in English, British history, forget the Scottish independence. And 2 of them have been to do with Europe. So it's not a common thing, but the fact that it's happened twice, and on something as important as relinquishing sovereignty. By joining the EU, you are relinquishing sovereignty. There's a gain, you think an economic gain, a geopolitical gain, all kinds of things, but you are surrendering sovereignty. So when you then argue that in a referendum the people have spoken, then you have popular sovereignty overriding the sovereignty of Parliament. And this is what you will always get. And this is why most supporters of representative parliamentary democracy are very, very nervous of plebiscites. Plebiscites on a single issue, often emotional, often irrational. And then if you take this as not advisory but binding, then the representatives in Parliament have to accept that the popular sovereignty is more important than the parliamentary sovereignty, and this creates all kinds of problems.
Helena, posso uma carona? Ele está dizendo a verdade. O plebiscito congela em um momento e dar a esse momento, que por definição é transitório, passageiro, emocional, uma validade permanente na história. Quer dizer, o problema da diplomacia, da política plebiscitária, é que ela se presta a uma sequência de atos que parecem irreversíveis, cada um. Portanto, a impressão que eu tenho, diante daquela derrota tão grande parlamentar, é que o poder na Inglaterra, no momento, não é atraente. A Theresa May não cai, porque ninguém quer ter essa batata quente nas mãos. Quer dizer, assim, eu tenho a impressão que há uma convicção de que ela se dá conta, porque aquela derrota foi tão esmagadora, era para levar a uma perda. Não, as pessoas sabem que aquilo é um processo em andamento, ninguém deseja, nesse momento ainda, vai acontecer. E eu tive um momento, e eu queria a sua opinião sobre isso, duas impressões. A primeira é que eu acho que não haverá, eu creio, num certo momento, um segundo referendo. O referendo não tem uma sacralidade que faça dele uma decisão, mas não vejo as condições dele acontecer e não vejo um resultado muito diferente da primeira vez. A segunda vez é que eu acho que a Inglaterra pode sair e pode voltar. A impressão que eu tenho é que a Inglaterra, nesse momento, está embarcada num processo de separação, distanciamento, mas num certo momento, eu volto a uma ideia napoleônica de geografia. A geografia é irresistível. A Inglaterra está onde a Inglaterra está. O Reino Unido está onde o Reino Unido está. Então, há um momento em que o entorno induz a preservação do Reino Unido. Quer dizer, só haverá a preservação do Reino Unido, eu creio, se a Inglaterra ficar dentro da Europa. Senão, a Irlanda se separa completamente, a Escócia pedirá um segundo referendo, que, mudando, em outras palavras, o que está em jogo, o que nós abrimos foi uma caixa que contém o diabo lá dentro. Quer dizer, como todo verdadeiro, eu não sou um reacionário, eu sou um conservador. O conservador é uma pessoa que quer cadência, quer ritmo, quer compasso. Eu quero que as coisas mudem, mas mudem de uma maneira que eu saiba de alguma maneira. O meu horror não é contra a mudança, é contra a velocidade. O meu inimigo é a pressa, é o correr. Vamos mudar, tudo tem de mudar por definição, mas eu queria que mudasse de uma maneira mais pausada, mais sobre eu não sei. Quem mais quer fazer alguma pergunta? Doutor Zé Pio Borges.
Uns 3 anos atrás, você me indicou aquele livro After Europe, daquele búlgaro.
Krastev.
Krastev.
Bulgária.
Que eu adorei e que eu me lembro que começava com um diálogo, repetindo um episódio do livro do Joseph Roth, sobre, que conta lá um momento que o arquiduque é morto e que se desfaz o Império Austro-Húngaro, e logo depois, com a Primeira Guerra, também se desfaz o Império Otomano, o que causou talvez grande parte dos desastres do século XX, das guerras, etc., inclusive a Segunda Guerra. Será que, e ele disse, não, é preciso pensar na possibilidade da Europa se desfazer, né, seriamente. Né? E será que isso é realmente, você chegou a comentar isso, mas será que nós estamos assim, no prenúncio desse acontecimento, como aconteceu e não se esperava no começo do século XX, a destruição dos dois grandes impérios? E eu estou lendo um livro agora que é chamado The Future is Asian, eu tenho comentado muito com a Ana, que alega que, na realidade, o grande fenômeno do século XXI não é a emergência da China, mas a reemergência da Ásia, em que a Índia, a Coreia, o Japão, a Indonésia e tal, o futuro está na Ásia. E será que essas duas coisas não estariam digamos, conectadas, que no futuro está na Ásia e a União Europeia talvez caminhe para o desfazimento.
If the future is Asian and the dominant powers over the next decades will be the United States and China, but Asia as a whole rising, then of course it's even more important that the EU should find a way of remaining together and working together in economics and geopolitics and defence. And this, because the question always is, where does Russia fit? Is Russia part of Europe or part of Asia? But of course, if that is the case, then they are linked, because it's another reason for supporting the continued integration and strength and prosperity of the united Europe. I agree, but like you, I think, I'm not sure I didn't suggest it to you, I think the Krastev book by this extraordinary Bulgarian intellectual called After Europe, really for the first time that I've recognized, raised the issue, well, the UK seems to want to leave Europe, and we're all concerned about this, the consequences of this, but isn't the EU disintegrating anyway? This is just part of it. What Farage represents now is what is every right-wing political party in Europe represents, and they are growing, and they are 20-25% in most major European countries, and they're in power in 3 or 4. And the critical thing will be what will happen next week. And the general feeling is that Macron will come below Le Pen in the elections, and Farage will certainly be above the Conservatives and the Labour. And so if there's a further push of these extreme right-wing populist parties, which are not always for leaving Europe, but they're very anti-EU, they want the disintegration. Not, they might, some of them, I don't think, are the Italians really wanting to leave the EU? They want to cause trouble inside the EU, and they want to change many things. But still, this is a sign. Krastev was writing at the time of maximum immigration. And his line in that book was that the immigration issue is what's going to break this. And that's somewhat weakened in the last year or so. If you look at the polls in the UK, immigration is not the issue it was in 2016. It's not the main preoccupation of people voting in the UK already. But still, the signs are there that it may not be such a straightforward as we used to think, that Europe, the ever closer union, ever greater prosperity, ever greater prominence in world politics, the Europe, united Europe. And that YouGov poll I mentioned, suggesting that people in European countries are already beginning to ask, will it be like this 10 or 20 years from now? And the answer is probably won't be. So there is a big question mark over the future of Europe. We should have a seminar on the future of Europe. That would be, I think it'd be quite the future of Europe in itself will be quite an interesting topic for a debate. Sorry, question.
Quer trazer o microfone?
Anna and Thomas.
O Leslie, obrigado pela apresentação, que realmente foi extremamente interessante. E eu estou querendo só voltar a alguma coisa coloquial, não tão grande como a Europa. Eu entendo que a Grã-Bretanha tem um parlamentarismo democrático, né, como você falou, baseado em 2 partidos, né, o Labour e os Tories. E no momento, me parece que ainda os conservadores estão no poder, têm o poder. Mas também me parece que é um poder sujeito a esfarelamento, a divisão desse poder. Uma situação desse tipo, que me parece que justifica a permanência da Theresa May, ou seja, tudo que você falou levaria a uma conclusão de que Theresa May já devia estar em casa, e não no 10 Downing Street. Mas não aconteceu. E isso é muito estranho para um outsider como nós ou eu. Agora, o que eu vejo é que esse parlamentarismo com 2 partidos, que é bem diferente do que seria no Brasil com 50 partidos, ou que foi na Itália naquele período em que se trocava de primeiro-ministro cada semana, eram só 2 partidos. Existe uma tradição enorme de quem um ganha e um perde. Agora, nesse caso, me parece, em relação ao Brexit, que os conservadores estão divididos de tal forma que o Partido Conservador são 2, já que o issue principal é o Brexit. E no momento que houvesse uma eleição hoje, digamos, talvez o Labour ganhasse. Você podia me falar quais seriam as consequências que se o Labour estivesse no poder em relação ao problema Brexit?
Well, on Theresa May, I think Marcus said it correctly. She's there in part because the Conservative Party is so divided that they can't come up with anybody. Because it's not true that nobody wants it, everybody wants it. They're fighting for it. There's a leadership contest going on already. They want to be the leader, they want to be Prime Minister. But the party itself can't agree on who would replace her if she were to leave. And there is always the fear that the membership of the Conservative Party want Boris Johnson. And the members of Parliament of the Conservative Party, for the most part, are horrified at the thought of another creature that we could talk about becoming Prime Minister. So there's always this. And then also, if May were to be forced to resign, then there is the danger that Labour would win and party loyalty kicks in. No Conservative is going to vote against May if he really thinks that the risk of Corbyn, because again, this is just as the immigration issue was unfortunately prominent at the time of the referendum. It was, for some people, not even for me, but for some people, it was unfortunate that Labour had been taken over by the left and that Corbyn was the leader. So whereas the Conservatives would always be worried about giving power to Labour, they were particularly worried about giving power to Labour led by Corbyn. So party loyalty came in, and that helped me. And then the third thing, of course, was, as we said, that the votes that she lost were not general votes on the position of the Conservative Party, the performance of the Conservative Party, that reflected in public opinion. It was only Brexit. It was only on Brexit. She would say, this is a vote about Brexit, not about my government, not about my premiership. It's about Brexit.
But is it?
We're divided.
But is it?
It was, absolutely. The votes were. No, they were absolutely about Brexit. And also, she's deeply, and has been, as Cameron was, that's what triggered off the whole mess. The divisions in the Conservative Party, going back to Thatcher, going back maybe to Heath. When Heath took the UK in, he needed Labour votes because he knew a big part of the Conservative Party was against Europe even then. So all through these decades, the party has been split on Europe, and every Prime Minister has tried to reduce that and keep the party together. And each time it looks more likely, as it does now, that it will split. So the party loyalty becomes very important. But it does look as though the party could well split over this. And nobody knows. If you look at the opinion polls, again, it's quite extraordinary. With one of the worst Conservative governments in memory, everybody agrees with that. The Labour opposition should be way ahead in the polls, and it's not. In some polls, it's behind. It's not certain that in an election, Corbyn will become Prime Minister, but it's possible. So that's a consideration. But the Labour Party, too, has been torn apart by Brexit. The Labour Party is deeply divided. It's divided over other issues, of course, because the Corbyn group in charge of the Labour Party is a minority of Labour MPs, but a majority of Labour members. It's the reverse of the Conservative situation. Corbyn has the members, but he doesn't have the MPs. And so there's always a danger. And in fact, a small group of Labour MPs did break away there's a new party called Change UK, 10 members so far, for Remain, and they broke away because they couldn't tolerate Corbyn's indecision or constructive ambiguity about Brexit. So it's destroying or undermining two major parties, allowing the Liberal Dems to resurge. They'd been nowhere for several 20 years, and suddenly, because they Remain, strongly Remain, then people are moving to the Lib Dems. And at the same time, Brexit, the Brexit Party, is representing all those who want to leave whatever. And that's the confusion of the political situation in Britain at the moment.
What is your bias on this issue? Leave, Remain?
Oh no, I was always Remain. No, I have no, I try to understand, not the populist arguments, but the serious conservative arguments about parliamentary democracy, about national sovereignty, and about independence and I mean, I'm well aware of these serious arguments, but I had never had, even though I was throughout my youth and beyond a Eurosceptic, I was always opposed. I always, like you, I always hated Brussels. There's a serious democratic deficit. The Commission is elected. Parliament is elected, but doesn't have a great deal of power and doesn't get more than a 40% turnout in polls. But the Commission is not. So democratic deficit, and I used to think this is just a conservative, neoliberal, market-orientated, anti-socialist organisation. And I was solidly in the Labour Party. And I was hostile to Europe, though it never crossed my mind that I would wish to leave. That seemed so radical and so unnecessary and so self-harming. This is a kind of national suicide we're talking about. This is a serious matter. So Remain. I've always been Remain.
What would be the economic basis of this leaving people? What is the project for England? So the economy, the English economy, the British economy is so based on service, banking, very low industrialization in certain areas. What is the project? What is the economic basis for this?
Well,
The pound,
well, a lot of it's fantasy. I mean,
ideology.
yeah, every serious economist is aware that some damage has already been done, and even if Remain is the outcome, and any form of Brexit will be damaging. But the Brexiteers live in this, what economists believe is fantasy world of thinking, Liam Fox, who was the international secretary, used to say, the easiest free trade deal ever negotiated will be between an independent UK and the EU. And everybody laughed at this because they know that the arrangement between Canada and the EU took 7 years. And this isn't Canada, this is the UK negotiating. But they believe that one of the arguments is, once we're out of the EU, we'll be able to make free trade agreements across the world. We'll be able to pursue our interests across the world. We can do free trade agreements with the United States, with Japan, with Brazil. There's negotiating free trade agreement with Brazil, and Britain will become a global player. There was a certain belief, which was ridiculed, of course, that we would fall back on the Commonwealth. That, well, Australia, New Zealand and Canada, Australia, New Zealand and Canada together, I think, make 60 million, a market of 60 million. This was supposed to solve the problem of losing the European. But also, of course, again fantasy, the belief in frictionless trade. We will leave the EU, but the EU will be desperate to negotiate with us because they need us too. And so we'll do deals, but we'll also deal with the rest of the world. So we'll have cakeism. We'll have our cake and eat it.
Muito obrigado aqui pela sua apresentação. De fato, uma das melhores apresentações que eu já vi para entender um pouco essa messe que vocês fizeram referência. Eu queria, na realidade, aproveitar, além do seu vastíssimo conhecimento sobre os fatos em si, também aproveitar o seu conhecimento sobre o Brasil. Como é que você vê o Brasil nesse contexto, quer dizer, com o Brexit ou sem Brexit? Passa um pouco sua impressão sobre isso.
I don't think I should comment on what I think is going on in Brazil. I've studied Brazil now for most of my life, I suppose. and I now live in Brazil, and I've never been more depressed than I am about the situation in Brazil. So I'd rather not talk about Brazil. But there is a question that I thought somebody would ask, and I knew, though now I see Simon there, I knew I wouldn't be able to answer. What is the impact of Brexit on UK-Brazil economic relations? And that's the question that I assumed somebody would ask, and I realised I don't know much about UK-Brazil economic relations. I don't know how important the trade is, or the investment. And I don't know, of course, if Britain remains in the EU, then I guess it's status quo, and nothing much changes. Britain is trying to negotiate a free trade deal with Brazil. That's been going on.
Not with Brazil, with Mercosur.
With Mercosur,
the EU Mercosur has been going on for a while. Britain has not been trying to negotiate any bilateral deals with Brazil, other than sector-by-sector agreements.
But I've heard in London that amongst the free trade agreements that will be possible post-Brexit, Britain could look to a deal with Brazil. It will be free. It will be free to make a deal with Brazil.
If we leave the customs
If we leave the customs union, we'd be able to make a free trade agreement with Brazil. Whether this would, how far this would stimulate UK-Brazil trade and flows of investment, I'm not sure. Part of it would depend on the tariff regime introduced in the UK post-Brexit. Would this help or not Brazilian exports to the UK? I suppose that's one of them. I'm looking at you because I really don't know enough about UK-Brazil.
No, I agree. It's, sorry, we can talk all day.
You were talking. Anna, sorry.
I don't know if eu falo. Eu gostaria de voltar pouco para esse tema econômico que a Maria Eduarda levantou aqui. E é o seguinte, eu acredito que além das questões políticas e sociais, existe um background de descontentamento econômico bastante grande por trás de tudo isso. Mas as perspectivas de um ganho econômico são muito remotas. Na verdade, o Banco da Inglaterra, ele mesmo predisse uma queda de 8% no PIB inglês com o Brexit. Então, a minha pergunta é, qual é a reação, por exemplo, da City com relação a isso? Por que o Labour Party, que tem o comando dos fatos, esse debate sobre as perdas não foi um debate mais forte, não foi um debate talvez até mais sério do que, na verdade, tem ocorrido?
Well, I agree. The calculation is that the UK has already, I read one economist arguing that the UK in the last 3 years has lost more than 2% GDP. As a result, manufacturing industry is leaving, car industry, banks, private equity. There was a long piece of Financial Times about private equity company, all very uncertain, some leaving, Frankfurt, Paris, Dublin. There's already a move out, and this is already affecting. And even if the decision were one way or another to remain in, the damage has been done. Assuming that Britain doesn't go in for the moment and leaves, a lot will depend on the kind of terms. But nobody denies there will be harm. But then the Bank of England, yes, an 8% loss. And the city is deeply alarmed at the possibility of a hard Brexit. Labour, of course, whatever it said in its manifesto, in all the negotiations of the last 2 years, very few Labour MPs are in favour of hard Brexit. They know that many of their members and electors are in favour of hard Brexit, but they, representing them, are not. Very few are in favour. Corbyn himself wants Brexit, but he wants Britain to stay in the customs union. Some of the others want to stay in the single market. It's going to be such a soft Brexit that maybe you'd hardly notice the difference, except UK wouldn't have a vote. UK will be out, no political influence in Brussels. But economically, it could be in a similar situation. But we're not anywhere near there. So yes, everybody's aware that this is economically damaging, seriously economically damaging. But the Brexiteers live in another world. They live in another world of past glories, past expectations, future possibilities. Make Britain great again. Imagine Farage using "Make Britain great again." They believe that it'll all work out for the best, and it's nonsense, I think.
Eu queria fazer uma observação. Há muitos anos a Europa tenta acomodar, eu digo a palavra Inglaterra, eu devia dizer Reino Unido, mas é tão irresistível para o brasileiro chamar o Reino Unido de Inglaterra, porque é a expressão que engloba. Mas quando eu digo Inglaterra, eu estou falando do Reino Unido, a Grã-Bretanha, de qualquer maneira. Durante décadas, a Europa acomodou o Reino Unido. Aceitou que houvesse uma Europa a duas velocidades, que os países fizessem parte do mundo de Schengen, um mundo de movimento livre de pessoas. A Inglaterra não faz parte, o Reino Unido não faz parte disso. Aceitou que o euro fosse apenas para alguns países, não para outros. Portanto, de certa maneira, a Europa já vivia num processo de acomodação com o Reino Unido, que não queria a totalidade do ticket, não queria o contrato completo. Portanto, isso já existia. E a Europa, para manter o Reino Unido dentro, faria outras concessões. Quer dizer, é de tal maneira importante para a Europa que o Reino Unido não se separe, que também do lado deles, nós estamos falando agora pela sua ótica aí, do que o Reino Unido está sentindo e vendo, mas a Europa está tendo uma sensação de ameaça e de perda, que ela queria ter evitado. Ela foi apanhada de uma maneira que não houve tempo de negociar nada. Quer dizer, quando houve um referendo, o jeu était fait, os jogos estavam feitos, a Inglaterra, o Reino Unido estava fora. Portanto, eu creio que nós temos em conta que havia uma acomodação em movimento. Tudo o que mais ofendia o Reino Unido, que era o movimento de gente, Schengen representou o Reino Unido fora. O euro, o Reino Unido fora. E uma série de outras coisas iam sendo negociadas, desde pesca, que é um assunto sensível, orçamento, que tudo havia um desejo de acomodação. O que surpreende é que a ruptura não, como ela foi abrupta, eu não quero usar uma palavra, uma guilhotina, que é mais uma metáfora francesa, mas foi um corte abrupto e instantâneo. Aquilo não houve um processo, vamos fazer isso. Quer dizer, pelo contrário, na Europa continental, a convicção também era de que o referendo ia dar um resultado confirmador do Remain. Essa era a presunção. De uns tempos para cá, um dos grandes derrotados no mundo são as agências de pesquisa de opinião. Durante décadas elas foram refinando os seus números. Elas eram quase infalíveis, variando 1%. Subitamente elas erraram tudo. Então você tem hoje uma situação de que, não vou defender David Cameron, mas ele presumiu, com base em previsões de agências de pesquisa, de que ele ia ganhar. Quer dizer, ninguém também entra de uma maneira tão suicida num processo, numa morte anunciada. Porque eu volto a isso, quer dizer, havia uma disposição europeia. Nós tratamos hoje tudo, naturalmente, da ótica britânica. Mas há uma sensação na Europa de perda. A saída do Reino Unido sugere para eles que o jogo começa a se desfazer. Eles queriam ir menos. Eles estão dispostos a fazer concessões importantes para manter. Mas não se deu essa situação virtualmente. Quer dizer, BREXIT criou uma situação categórica. Por favor.
Pegando uma carona num comentário que o Marco fez sobre a Inglaterra, o Reino Unido tendo seu momento latino-americano.
I made a point of saying from the very beginning that this is an English issue, but we're talking about the UK.
Ok. Eu lembro uma frase cunhada pelo Walter de Góes nos anos 80, a respeito da situação política brasileira, que ele dizia que no Brasil de hoje, quem não está confuso está mal informado. Essa observação continua válida até hoje em respeito ao Brasil. Ela se aplica ao Reino Unido? Não, absolutamente.
Nothing to add to that, I agree. Yes. Yes.
Sandra.
Eu queria voltar à discussão sobre perspectivas de um eventual acordo entre Reino Unido e Mercosul. Eu acho que essa ideia de um acordo Reino Unido-Mercosul, ou Reino Unido-Brasil, ganhou impacto logo depois da votação. Muita gente aqui no Brasil ficou animada com essa possibilidade. Talvez um pouco com a expectativa de que isso seria um contraponto às demoradas e não exitosas negociações com a União Europeia. A percepção de que seria mais fácil negociar com o Reino Unido, um país menos protecionista em agricultura, menos complexo em termos de tomada de decisão. Eu acho que a questão é saber, e certamente por tudo que foi dito aqui, pelo que a gente lê, o Reino Unido não sabe qual é a política comercial que adotará, ou que gostaria de adotar após BREXIT. A gente já vê na imprensa discussões sobre se as tarifas agrícolas, se a política agrícola seria parecida com a da União Europeia ou se seria muito diferente. Já tem brigas políticas internas em relação a isso. E qualquer negociação depende de qual vai ser a tarifa imposta pelo Reino Unido. Eu tenho a impressão que nas outras áreas, serviços, investimentos, etc., talvez até uma negociação com o Mercosul possa ser mais fácil. Mas a questão fundamental vai continuar sendo que política comercial o Reino Unido vai adotar para que possa apresentar alguma proposta de negociação com outros países.
I agree entirely. We've discussed this, that the possibilities for Simon will comment now. The possibilities for UK-Brazil relations depends on whether there is Brexit. If there's no Brexit, then nothing changes much. If there's a Brexit, what kind of Brexit? Is there a customs union? Is there a single market? Or is it a complete crash out where Britain's free to do anything it chooses with Brazil? So it's really difficult, I find, to answer that question because we don't know what the situation will be 6 months, 3 months from now, or a year from now. We don't. This could go on. Remember, if there was another extension because nothing had been decided, or because they promised an election or promised a referendum, that could allow the EU to extend it further, so we could be deep into 2020 and still wondering what the outcome is. And then once we have an outcome, there'll be years. And as Rubens Barbosa said at a conference in Sao Paulo, he said, don't get overexcited in Brazil. When Brexit happens, suppose it's a hard Brexit, the British government will be deeply involved negotiating with 27 European countries. And then it'll be thinking of the United States, and then it'll be thinking of India, and then and Brazil may be well down the list of priorities. But do you want to say something, Simon?
Yeah, I'm not a trade policy expert. Sorry, Simon Wood, the Consul General of the UK in Rio. So I'm not a trade policy expert either. At the moment, the biggest Brazilian exports to the UK are agricultural products. So absolutely, that is dependent on the trading arrangements that we come up with. In terms of Brazilian exports to here, obviously that's not necessarily governed by trading regions in the same way, because we export, or not as much of it is, we export less in the way of goods here. A reasonable amount, slightly more than goes to the UK, but a lot of our business interests here are in service related, are oil and gas related, are financial services related. So the bilateral things we already can talk about in terms of services agreements, double taxation, recognition of services, those are some of the things that we already talk about that will continue, and I think a lot of that can be done on a bilateral basis. But as with that, as a political, I think we're beyond, actually, as a government official, it's kind of gone beyond the stage where government officials have interesting things to say, because we're told just to say what Theresa May has said. But it's certainly, it's very hard, and you see our politicians are talking about our future trading arrangements and talking about countries without, if you don't know what your policy is going to be, how do you decide where you're going to apply it? Am I allowed to make 2 quick comments if I've got a microphone since you gave it to me? Ambassador Marcos, I wanted to correct your British English. You described it as a mess. I think in British English, we'd really say this is a bit of a mess. Which is much stronger.
Oh, there are stronger words than the words that we don't use here.
And sorry for but I wanted to throw in one example. I don't know if you agree, Leslie, it helps understand how the emotional appeal of Brexit went beyond the rational economics. In the UK, when you have an election, we have paper voting, not electronic voting. So it's always a race after the polls close to be the first constituency to announce the result. The usual winner of that is Sunderland in the northeast of England. And Sunderland is now dominated by Nissan, a car company, who have a huge factory there, exports to Europe, hugely dependent obviously on smooth flows of trade inside and outside, from EU into UK and out. Personally, for me, it was a great shock when the Sunderland result came in on the referendum election night. First one to declared for leave. And so that's the emotional appeal. Workers in Sunderland who know well that the company, and not just in Nissan, in all the supply chain that sits around there, who know full well, they see the parts coming in on their cars, they see how they go, they see that smoothness of trade. The emotional appeal and the success of the Brexit arguments went beyond that kind of rational analysis. And for me, that was a good, just in terms of how the politics worked, was remarkable.
Eu ia encerrar a reunião, que eu creio que já excedemos o tempo que tínhamos. Eu queria dizer ao cônsul do Reino Unido, no Rio de Janeiro, que ele tem razão. O que há na Inglaterra é a bit of a mess. O que há no Brasil é a mess. De modo que essa é a correção que eu faço. Eu queria dizer primeiro que nós tivemos uma reunião útil, que eu acho que tem que ser seguida. Isso é um processo. Que o Leslie fosse, ele é nosso, ele parte do mundo nosso, mas que daqui a algum tempo ele voltasse, porque isso é melhor que o Game of Thrones. É um jogo de emoções que se renovam, e eu creio que nós tivemos uma visão lúcida, clara do que está acontecendo. E o que eu queria dizer, já que o cônsul está aqui, que ele transmita sempre a Londres os bons desejos do Brasil. O Brasil tem um interesse permanente na felicidade do Reino Unido, no seu sucesso, na sua prosperidade. O Reino Unido é parte da nossa história, do nosso presente e eu espero do nosso futuro. De modo que tudo que foi dito aqui foi dito num espírito de amizade, de solidariedade a um mundo civilizado, de que o Reino Unido é uma expressão tão importante. Não convém nada que enfraqueça o Reino Unido. A civilização nossa precisa da presença deles.